All right, welcome to another episode of ICU Doc Talk. Today I'm going to talk about Tele ICU, which is a part of the practice that I'm in, which is like remote ICU. It's like doing intensive care remotely, like off location through cameras and stuff. And oftentimes people are like, what is that? How does that work? I'm going to tell you how it works and a little bit about the practice that I'm a part of. So here we go. So just backing up, I'm sure it's in the news a lot. It's been, the last, 5 years, particularly during the pandemic, telemedicine, and the rise of telemedicine, and I think it can still be, could be controversial. People don't really know what it is. Is this really effective? Is this just a way of hospitals maximizing their profit, not actually having, not having proper staffing and stuff? And I think criticisms of telemedicine are, worth considering as well. But I do think it has a lot of advantages, and I think it does help out. The basic. Obviously, it's remote, right? Just boiling it down, what are the basic concepts of telemedicine? It's remote care where a provider is off-site, right? They're on the other side of the country, and they are interacting with a patient by, live camera feed, and obviously talking to them, and then having access to the patient's medical record, to their electronic medical record, their chart, and then helping with decision making remotely. That in its most basic sense, that's what telemedicine is, and that's what tele intensive care, Tele ICU, is as well. Now, the rise of Tele ICU, during the pandemic, it was extremely important to have Tele ICU. Tele ICU, medicine is not everywhere. Not every institution has them. For sure, it's completely kind of just all over the place what institutions provide Tele ICU and what institutions do not. But typically, there's like a central hub of providers and nurses, like NPs and PAs and physicians, and then ICU nurses. So now, all of my discussion here is talking about Tele ICU. There's other types of telemedicine, right? Telepsychiatry, all this, different things. And that central site, that physical site, can camera in and can consult with multiple other locations that have the hardware and infrastructure to receive, the services, right? So you can have one central location, and they are providing services to many, many locations. So in the practice that I'm a part of, that is the case. We provide Tele ICU to multiple sites within the same state and out of the state as well. Now, particularly during COVID-19, the really bad portion of the pandemic, the early phases and Omicron and Delta, if you recall back in New York, where they were completely overwhelmed with infections, and then that played out on similar scales throughout the rest of the country. What the issue was that many people don't, a lot of people do realize, but not everybody, is that the ICU beds were completely overrun. Not overrun. That's the wrong term. They were filled to capacity with COVID patients, and ICUs, like one institution, all of their ICUs would have COVID patients. Like my institution, I remember very clearly during Delta and Omicron, we had COVID patients in literally every type of ICU at my large academic center. In our cardiac ICU, in our medical ICU, in our surgical ICU, we had COVID patients literally in the ICU intensive care. Often, and many of them needing a ventilator. So when you have that many patients in an ICU, you are now displacing other patients, and you're having a spillover effect of very sick patients all over your hospital and where to house them, and then how to staff them. And critical care is a particular branch of medicine that you need to be trained, you're specifically trained in and experienced in to be able to do. So what was going on in New York and other places is you had physicians that were not trained in critical care, who are the main physician taking care of COVID patients, vented patients, treating them for ARDS. So Tele ICU really came in to help provide guidance to these providers, right? If you have like someone who's not trained in these things, a physician, they needed help, and it was wanted help, like they needed help, and so Tele ICU really absolutely provided that guidance for an intensive care team, the ICU nurses and NPs and PAs and an ICU physician to look at a patient's chart and to give guidance and even go on rounds with each and every patient remotely. And that was invaluable help. That I know that my institution was a part of that, and other institutions were, and it was I know that save patients' lives, and it provided very timely and needed medical guidance for patients. So that was a tremendous and incredible use of Tele ICU medicine during that time. So in my opinion, Tele ICU is not a worse version of real intensive care. It is the care that someone would normally get, and it's augmented by having an ICU team to be able to help out. What I mean by this is, I think the perfect setup for Tele ICU medicine is you have a small hospital that has maybe a small bed ICU, like 10 beds or something, in a part of the country that has a smaller population. And now intensive care physicians and NPs and PAs are kind of there's not a lot around, right? If you look at the country, like there's doctor shortages and provider shortages everywhere, so there's not a lot around. So you can't always every ICU, right? In the United States, obviously I'm just talking about U.S. medicine here. Every ICU there's not an intensivist for every ICU that's out there. And some people, so let's say we're talking about like a rural small town that has it has a ICU. Now there are some people that are sick, but they're not super sick, and they can be admitted to an ICU like that, and it can be run by a non-intensivist provider, typically like a hospitalist, which is an internal medicine trained physician, or an NP or a PA, and they can provide good, quality critical care, assuming that the patient's needs are not that high, meaning their acuity and how sick they are, it matches the care that can be provided. And it's not just a experience and skills I'm talking about. It's also resources that hospital has. Like, does it have respiratory therapy? Does it have the staff there to also support how sick that patient is? If I'm making any sense. So a good setup for this is a hospital system like that has a small bed ICU, and someone has, say they're admitted with like hyponatremia, right? They have low sodium and it needs to be corrected. Now that's an easy thing to correct. Any experience like a hospitalist provider can do that in their sleep. And having an intensive care team remotely be able to also counsel with that patient and counsel with that team just as like a backup. That's good. That you're augmenting that patient's care team. You're augmenting it. So it's not lesser care provided. You're actually providing them better care. And then because you have an ICU team at your disposal somewhere in another part of the country or part of the state, you can also, if they get worse, you can be like, hey, I think this patient's worse. I think our facility cannot handle them because we don't have the resources. I think they should be transferred out. And so we can counsel with they can counsel with an intensive care team to arrange for maybe this patient needs to be transported. So it's like a backup team for already the medically appropriate team for the acuity of what's going on with that patient, if that makes sense. So a big part of my job as an intensivist in a Tele ICU practice, which is a very small part of my practice, at my institution we have a very robust Tele ICU practice, which is it's the most robust I've ever seen. It's quite phenomenal. And I practice in it every now and then. So it's not all the critical care I do. I'm usually in the cardiac ICU, which I may have already mentioned in this podcast. I'm forgetting. Anyway, so a big part of my job as the remote Tele ICU intensivist is triaging, right? For those that aren't familiar, triaging is figuring out who is the most sick and who needs the highest level of care. And, it's in its basic sense, that's what triaging is. It's an enormous part of my job. And even more so during the pandemic. So a big part of my job is when a patient gets admitted to a remote center. That's part of the health system I'm a part of, or not. We've also covered places that are not necessarily a part of our health system, but we have contracts with them. So a big part of my job is I review the patient's chart, right? And again, I know I've already said this and it's obvious. This is all remote. I am literally sitting at a bunch of computers, at a bunch of screens, at a computer, doing all these things. So I review a patient's chart, their labs, and try to read the tea leaves in their chart, right? A patient's chart has variable information. Some of it's very useful, some of it is not. Sometimes it gives a nice bit of the picture. Sometimes you're missing a big pieces of the puzzle. So I'm alerted that a patient is getting admitted to higher level care at this center, or the intensive care or a progressive care unit, and maybe they're a little sick. And as maybe I already mentioned, sorry, I'm recording this like weeks later, so I forget what I already said in the last like 10 minutes. Some of it is like, oh, they're just being admitted with hyponatremia, low sodium, which is very routine, basically protocolized management at this point. And the provider there, which is typically a hospitalist, of course, doesn't need my help with that. And the hospitalists rarely need my help with anything, except with people that are getting worse and their acuity is getting worse, and maybe they need help with, hey, should we transfer this patient out, and managing them as they become as they decompensate. I think that's where I have me personally, as the intensivist. Now, there's a whole nursing side of this, right? There's as I already mentioned, I work alongside Tele ICU nurses, and they also help with the nursing staff, and they give nursing breaks and things like that. So they also have a job that is also extremely valuable and different than my job is. And they also accompany me with the treatment of sick patients remotely as well. And also nurse practitioners and physician assistants are also part of this practice that I'm mentioning. Anyway, so a big part of my job is to triage. So, I look at a patient's chart and I'm like, oh yeah, this is basic hyponatremia. And then I'll talk to the provider there and be like, yeah, okay, looks good. I don't really have much to say. And I'll also video into the patient's room. Now, this can sometimes be alarming to patients, because these patients, so there's a lot of big infrastructure in place here, right? The patients have a screen and they have a camera in all of the rooms, and it's extremely high resolution cameras. So I can zoom into these patients' rooms. I can zoom it all the way in. I can see the readings on the ventilator. I can see all the readings on all the pumps, the vitals. Like, it has really good resolution. So I really, you kind of think like, oh, you're not really there. Well, yeah, you're not there. But actually, with a high resolution camera, and then with the patient's chart in front of me, and I can also bring up the patient's vitals, I can get all the information from that patient's room as if I'm standing there, except I can't do a physical exam, right? And I also don't have quite the presence of being there physically, but there's a lot of information I can get, especially with that high resolution camera. So I will camera into the patient's room, and I will, talk to them if they're coherent, and see how they're doing. Sometimes it's very brief because I don't have a lot to add, and that's totally fine. Sometimes it's a little more detailed. And I'm also, at this point, I'm like probably the fifth provider or something, third, fourth, fifth that's talked to them. They're kind of like over it, so I don't try to bug them too much. And I already know a ton of the information, so I don't go into enormous detail, history and physical, because I don't need to, and I already have that information. So a lot of times it's just really routine, and I say, you know what, I'm in the background if I'm needed for anything, and I'm off more often than not. I'm not needed for anything, and that could be that's it for my interaction with that patient. It's when things start going bad that I feel like I have meaningful intervention. So I'll give an example. There's a patient who came in alcohol withdrawals, right? Very typical admission for like particularly like a smaller community hospital. So alcohol withdrawal, it's pretty basic management. You give people benzos, you watch them for DTs and withdrawal symptoms and seizure symptoms, and you keep them safe. You keep staff safe as well, because sometimes these patients can be combative and aggressive because they're so out of it. So anyway, there was a patient that was admitted with pretty routine alcohol withdrawal. And then like a day later, she started to go into like blood pressure was low and heart rate was high, which was like, she wasn't intubated or anything. It's like, I don't know what's going on here. So over the course of an hour, she really started to get worse. And over that course of that hour, I was cameraed into the patient's room the entire time, because she clearly was not doing well based on her vitals. Her blood pressure started to drop. She needed vasoactive, like, I don't even remember, norepinephrine, phenylephrine, something like that. So we were giving those things. And the patient had also received an echo, and this is a relatively young patient, like middle-aged, and a patient had an echocardiogram, and her EF, or ejection fraction, was quite low. It was like 25%, which was unexpected. The patient had never been diagnosed with cardiomyopathy or basically her heart was weak and it wasn't pumping very well. And so it was like, it was coming pretty obvious that this patient was in new decompensated cardiogenic shock. And I think she was probably walking around with her SVR, her systemic vascular resistance, through the roof, compensating for her poor pump. And then we had sedated her with like dexmedetomidine or Precedex and benzos to prevent withdrawals, and that took her SVR away from her. The resistance of her vascular system, it took that away by virtue of sedating her, and the pharmacological action of the medications like Precedex. And it dropped her, and that was dropping her blood pressure, and it was pushing her into shock. And so it was during this time, and she needed to be intubated, right? So I'm there present. Okay, I got another story too. I'll share in a minute. So I was there, cambered in while, and I think it was an ED or anesthesia provider came up and did the intubation. But I'm also there to help out with, hey, what induction aid? I'm just an extra set of hands, an extra brain there, right? Which is always good for the patients. Now, maybe that might ruffle providers' feathers in the room that are providing direct care to have someone, quote, watching over their shoulder. And if that's their perception, honestly, that's their problem. It's not my problem. The more eyes on a patient, I don't care what setting, the better. It doesn't matter. The ego, I don't really care about someone's ego. It doesn't matter. I would love if I, as an intensivist, in every room I was treating a patient, that there was someone cambered in somewhere also helping. That would be fantastic. So anyway, if you work in Tele ICU, if you're listening to this, and people are like, oh, they're kind of bothered by you, that's their problem. It's their problem. It's not your problem. Anyway, what was I getting at? Oh yeah, so it was like, I was there present helping with intubation, and then it was like, okay, we obviously need to bring this patient to the our main academic center campus because they're becoming way unstable. They're on multiple pressors. They're now intubated. They're in decompensated cardiogenic shock, I suspect. They need to go to our cardiac ICU for stabilization, and then if things don't get better, for further workup for maybe advanced mechanical circulatory support or something like that. So I arranged that transport, which can take a long time, right? It's a big part of my job in Tele ICU is communicating with others and communicating with lots and lots of different personalities and lots of different personalities who are in different phases of their day, meaning sometimes they're a little more stressed. Sometimes they don't really have tolerance to talk to someone like me. So I have to navigate that a lot, which is totally fine. Yeah. Okay, and then I want to share something else. During the pandemic, this was so awful. What I'm about to share to you, okay. So during the height of the pandemic, Omicron, Delta, the COVID patients were falling out of everywhere. Everybody had COVID. Everybody had COVID. All calls I was getting calls all over across many states with help for COVID and transferring COVID. Hey, this patient's really sick. We need to bring him or her to you. All that constantly. Okay. So hospitals have something called diversion. When a hospital's bed capacity gets too full. So major tertiary care centers, like where I work at in the United States, we accept transfers, right, from other, and that's a big part of my job is triaging, accepting transfers from different states, lots of different hospitals. That's a big part of my job. So being able to glean information, talk to providers, and see, is this patient appropriate for transfer or not? So, what was I saying? So I was getting calls all the time. Hey, so diversion. So we'll go in. Hospitals will go on diversion, meaning we're too full. We can't we can't take any transfers right now. So because we're on diversion. So that's routine. That's like a basic thing in major academic centers or major hospitals to go on diversion. So when we're on diversion, I don't even take phone calls from from other centers for transfer because there's no point because we can't accept them. So I don't even hear the story, right? So I'm like the gatekeeper about if a patient's going to get transferred to our center. And this is intensive care. Mostly. Actually, it's more than intensive care too. But anyway, I don't want to bore you with the details. So what was I saying? So during Delta and Omicron, there was every one of our ICUs, right? Our medical ICUs, cardiac ICUs, thoracic ICUs, cardiovascular ICUs, they all had COVID patients, which is unheard of, right? In our modern age of medicine, to have one infectious disease causing critical illness in every ICU, that's insane. Okay, now we're past that, right? That phase will never happen again. But it was awful, and it directly had to do with poor mitigation factors, for sure. and poor public policy, without a doubt in my mind, and poor vaccine uptake. I know that without a doubt. I don't care what anyone reads, whatever bullshit they read online, right? I know that without a doubt, that if vaccination uptake were better, and if people adhere to if there was better public policy across the place of mitigation factors, it wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have been as bad. Anyway, what was I saying? I keep getting... Oh, yeah, so diversion. Okay. So during this period, I was triaging a bunch of patients with COVID. We would go on diversion, and then I would stop hearing about it. I wouldn't get any calls from our transfer center, right? There's a bunch of nurses in a transfer center that are also helping with these phone calls. At the minute we would come off diversion, my phone was going off the hook constantly with, hey, I have this patient. And here's... It wasn't just COVID patients. Okay, so... It wasn't just, we have a patient, they're on a ventilator, they're dying, can they come to you? It wasn't just that. It was that. But as soon as we came up to diversion, I would hear, I have a patient that is in the emergency department, in my hallway, in the emergency department, who needs urgent dialysis. I can't offer dialysis. No center will take them. They're going to die if they don't get dialysis. Do you know how insane that is? For someone to be in a hallway, and this is no fault of the provider who's talking to me, everything was full. There's nowhere to transfer the patient from states and states away, simply because they needed dialysis. And I was like, now I normally am not going to take a patient just because they need dialysis because they can get it elsewhere. But under these circumstances, I had to bring the patient because they were going to die. Okay, so I was like, yeah, of course I'm going to bring this patient. So I, accepted the patient. I had space for the patient just to get dialysis. And then we went back on diversion. So do you know how many people were just sitting in hospital somewhere, dying of things that were preventable or treated because they couldn't get transferred? So that they did. People, without a doubt, patients without COVID, without a doubt died because they did not get expedited care that they need, because hospitals were surging with capacity. That is a fact. That is an absolute fact. I saw it firsthand. I saw it many, many, many times. So this patient, I was thinking, I was like, wow, if we were still in diversion, I wouldn't have heard about this patient, and this patient potentially could have just died in a hallway in an emergency department because they needed dialysis. You know how insane that is? Ugh, seriously. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. That is really what was going on. So there's so much disinformation and nonsense everywhere but I'm telling you firsthand, I was there. These things were happening. People were dying needlessly because hospitals were full of unvaccinated patients when the vaccines were available. Absolutely insane. It's just and I'm not blaming the people that died, unvaccinated people that died, even though if they refused the vaccine. They were just victims of political disinformation that politicized the pandemic and politicized the vaccines. And this still goes on today. And obviously you can tell I'm pretty pissed about it and upset. And I still make TikTok videos trying to educate people. Anyway, so that gives you just a glimpse of what that was all about. Anyway, I don't really have that much more to say about Tele ICU. I think it's cool practice. If you're listening, you're part of practice. Hello. I think you're awesome. So there's a lot of criticism there can be criticism about Tele ICU, like, it's a hospital's way of generating more revenue, and without actually having an in-room provider and things like that. And all that criticism, I don't think it's unfounded, right? This can apply to a lot of tele services, like psychiatric telemedicine or cardiology telemedicine, whatever. I'm going to bring up those examples, not for any specific reason. So I think that may be true. I think that criticism is not unfounded, right? This is a way to generate more revenue with less providers. But I don't know what to say. It also helps. This strategy also helps. It also expands care in an age of shortage of healthcare providers. So it's probably all those things all at once. Probably. And I'm not super knowledgeable about the rest of the logistics of Tele ICU and stuff. I just kind of show up and sit in a chair and do my best, along with my other colleagues. And I'm happy to be part of the practice. I think it's service that we do. I think it's a good service to patients. I think it's good that we have it, that exists. And I think Tele ICU should be expanded, and I think it should be done safely and appropriately. It should not supplant ICU care for very, very sick patients, right? It should not. You need in-person intensivist and an intensive care team for major high acuity critical care. Obviously. Okay, I'm going to move on to answering a question. This is from someone on TikTok named Azans. And their question is, what can a med student do on an ICU rotation to stand out? Like advice for a med student. So for me, a medical student on an ICU rotation. So for one thing, it's very new to medical students. And if it's not new, they've probably had limited experience in the ICU. And it's an extremely intimidating place for a medical student. I remember being very intimidated by the intensive care unit. I'd be like, whoa, it's like a medically complex, kind of not scary, but just like very intimidating place. So the fact that you're even showing up and wanting to be in an ICU is great. Like that's impressive enough because not all med students have to do ICU rotations depending on where you go to school. So anyway, I'm impressed right at the bat that you're showing up. So there's, the standard things like, being on time and not showing up halfway through rounds with a cup of coffee in your hands, right? You got to avoid those things. Those things leave bad impressions. And impressions matter, unfortunately. They do. But anyway, to impress, which unfortunately, I hate that we have to like talk this way and be evaluated by how much you impress people. But anyway, that's just the fundamentals of our medical education system. What I'm impressed with is when medical students, they know their patients well. That's number one. If you know your patients well, so you have how many patients you have assigned, 2 or 3. You don't need to like memorize their chart, right? You don't have to know all their labs and everything off the top of their head, but understanding the global picture of what's going on with the patient, that's impressive because that's a hard thing to do as a medical student. When you're a medical student, you get so bogged down and lost in the little details, and you kind of partition off each detail as if like, okay, well, their lab values were this and this and this, and they're also in kidney failure. Maybe they have some esoteric kidney disease that we've never heard of. Like, no, it's probably their heart failure that's causing their kidney failure. Like, it's not that thing that you studied last week. Very unlikely. So medicines have a tendency to silo off the different body organ systems, and they struggle. Not all med students, but sometimes they struggle thinking more globally about the patient, and then they also struggle thinking about what is the overall plan. Can you sum up the plan for this patient in one sentence today? That's impressive. And even though patients are complex, particularly in the cardiac ICU where I spend most of my intensive care time, these are complex patients. But you should be able to, for that day, be like, basically, the patient has this, this, and this. Today we're going to do this. And the overall plan is this. You should be able to do that in a sentence. You can do that for any patient. It doesn't matter how complex they are. Because when you're synthesizing and understanding information and assimilating it in your brain, trying to come up with a plan, it takes experience. You need to know what is pertinent information and what is not pertinent information. And that is a difficult thing for medical students, particularly medical students in an unformulated environment, meaning everything is new. You haven't created mental heuristics and shortcuts to understand things. You don't know what is extraneous information now. Maybe it was very important 3 days ago, but now it's extraneous. That is hard for a medical student. So if a medical student is able to synthesize all that information, understand what is important, what is not important, synthesize a plan, and then understand their patients from a global perspective and be able to talk about their patients in a non-mechanical way, but in a more, just a more holistic way, that's impressive. Because not all medicines do that in the ICU. Many medicines do that in other services, right? But sometimes the ICU is just a little more difficult. So that stands out. Knowing your patients and understanding the global plan, and then asking questions. That's impressive. You should ask questions because you should have questions. If you're a medical student in the ICU, you are going to have questions. You do not understand everything out intensive care. I don't care if you're at the end of your 4th year of medical school, that you need to be asking questions. And then never assuming anything and never doing something that you're not unsure of and you were too afraid to ask. To me, maybe I've said it before, that's the only mistake a medical student, a true mistake a medical student can make, is acting when they were unsure and they were too afraid to ask. That's bad. That to me that needs remediation. That's something that needs remediation. But anyway, what I'm saying is a hard thing to do. Knowing your patients is a hard thing to do. That's why it's impressive, because not all medicines do this, and it takes time, it takes experience to be able to do that. But I've seen it, and it's impressive. Yeah, there you go. There's my answer. All right, today let's get into some books. I'm going to talk about one nonfiction and one fiction, and I think you should hear about both these books. And I'm not going to talk about sci-fi or fantasy or anything today, so I think you should stay to the end of this. So I'm sorry that I have to talk about this book with you, but you need to know, if you don't already, the things that occurred in China at the hands of the Japanese Empire in like around 1932. The book is called The Rape of Nanking. It's by Chang, and it was written in 1997. It's about 300 pages. So I put off reading this book for years because I had a pretty good idea of the horror that was wreaked upon China during the Second Sino-Japanese War, and the particular massacre, basically Holocaust, and the widespread rape of the people of Nanking in 1938 is when this happened. So Chang, she boldly opens the reader's eyes into the war crimes and crimes against humanity executed by the Japanese Empire during that time. Somewhere between 200 and 300,000 civilians were murdered by Japanese soldiers, and around 80,000 women were raped. Chang does not hold back on the descriptions of body horror and torture that happened during this time. I will spare you those descriptions, but they're vivid, and you can't forget the things that are described. So you shouldn't read this book if that's going to be a problem for you. But this book isn't just recognizing the horrors that occurred. It's also about some really incredible individuals using their political clout to help save many thousands of Chinese within the city during this time. You get the story of a Nazi named John Rabe, R-A-B-E. And he was part of the Nazi party, and he lived in Nanking in China. And he was elected the leader of the Nanking Safety Zone, which helped save thousands of Chinese. He was elected because of his political status and Nazi influence at that time. Rabe also opened up his properties to save refugees. Chang did more research to figure out what happened to this guy. When he returned to Germany, he lectured about the massacre and even sent his research to Hitler to make him aware of the war crimes. He was promptly arrested and reprimanded. He eventually became destitute later in his life, but he did receive some recognition by many Chinese scholars later in his life who helped care for him. You also get the story of a man named Robert Wilson, an American. He was the only surgeon who stayed in the city during the massacre to help the Chinese victims. So there's this really amazing subplots going on of these very incredible individuals. This book also contains a scathing reprimand of the Japanese Empire and later government that failed to fully recognize the war crimes committed and withholding of reparations like that were done in modern Germany. The massacre in Nanking is a forgotten Holocaust which was purposely suppressed not only by Japan but the U.S. when they later wanted an ally with Japan against Soviet forces in Russia and Korea. So, reading this book, and this book is just incredible. The author is amazing. She later committed suicide, unfortunately, but this book is extremely influential and has helped many, many people understand what happened in Nanking during this time. So, when you read a book like this, you ask yourself, how could this happen? In my opinion, it's the system that was created. Bad systems create bad people, by and large, in my opinion. The Japanese Empire sought ethnic and cultural authority over all of Asia with likely global ambitions. So when you debase the humanity of your soldiers, you rob them of their own lives, and you unleash them on a vulnerable and conquered people, you get genocide and crimes against humanity. That's when you dehumanize your soldiers, they dehumanize their victims. Government systems matter, and that is the highest lesson for me from this book. These crimes can happen anywhere when certain conditions are met. And for me, these are the conditions, and they're not just isolated to this, but these are the conditions. Authoritarian rule, a vulnerable populace, economic downturns, and then the geopolitical conditions that ripen for war. Those are the conditions you need to watch for. I think that's when stuff like this happens, when you have those conditions. I would argue that current humanity has not graduated away from these conditions. And what happened in Nanking It can happen now. War crimes can and are happening right now, in fact. So this book's called The Rape of Nanking by Chang. Reader beware, do not read this if what I've described to you is not, you'll know if you shouldn't read this book, but you should know about it. Okay, and then I'm just going to tell you about another book that I just read recently, and it's one of the best fiction books I've ever read. Okay? Modern, recent, and it was published this year. It's called Wellness, just Wellness, by Nathan Hill. It was published in September 2023, and it's about 600 pages. So it's a long fiction book, modern-day fiction book. And to me, this is incredible fiction that defines our current era. It's one of the best novels I've ever read. This is fiction that is so well written and so relevant to modern life that it defines the current zeitgeist with its story. It's a book most concretely about a marriage between characters Jack and Elizabeth. And it's told over a kaleidoscope narration of when the couples meet in college, and then 20 years later when their marriage has been predictably calcified and now complicated by a child and all the other highly relatable stressors of life. This story has some of the most fleshed out characters I've ever read. Nathan Hill takes his time telling the backstory of these two extremely traumatized individuals, and he does it with wit, humor, drama, and it's extremely engaging. The author's an absolute brilliant writer and storyteller, and this book will draw you in with the first sentence, and it'll keep you there until the last sentence, I promise. I laughed a ton reading this, and I definitely cried listening to the audiobook, which was a phenomenal performance. I recommend the audiobook. The very ending of this book left me, seriously, I was just crying. I was on my way to work, and I had tears at the end of the book. How the backstory of the two main characters informs their current actions and their relationship with one another is simply one of the best things I've ever read. This book is a perfect picture of life in the 2010s and now. In a generation when people want to know what life was like for an adult right now, particularly married and with children, they should read this book and they'll get a very good glimpse. This book is about the fracturing that has occurred. A fracturing of individuals because of the failure of their parents and communities and traditions, the fracturing of society into rural and coastal elites, a fracturing of our attention by the disruption of surveillance capitalism, which has been shoehorned through social media. It's also about a fracturing of understanding one another and the alienation that is imposed upon us by a default culture that has been hollowed out and atomized for monetization. This book is about the endless, quote, life hacks, right, that only mask the deeper issues that people have and obfuscate the solutions, which are developing deeper connections with one another with compassion and understanding. But don't get me wrong, this book is not just about cynicism. This book is about so much more than just being cynical over society or cynical of marriage. This book is about the hope of pioneering into a new era, and with that hope, the compulsion to try and understand where we are and how to move forward together, knowing that life is more about coping than about trying to obtain certainty. That was my kind of take home from this book. The author is a very smart guy, and he brought a lot of concepts that you can tell he wants to talk about. He uses this book as an opportunity to riff on lots of social and cultural issues, and he does it with a lot of style and humor and compassion. This book has one of the best takes on Facebook and social media I've ever read. The relationship with Jack and his dad, and they argue on Facebook a whole bunch. It is hilarious and extreme. It's unbelievable. It's incredible. I honestly, I cannot recommend this book enough. I've been thinking about it every day since I last read it. It's kind of hard to read. I think a trigger warning would be whatever you're having trouble with in life right now, it's probably going to be found in this book, and it might kind of trigger you to be like, ugh. You might think this book is cynical, and it might depress you, but I promise you, the ending is quite beautiful. I think this book is a balm for the modern soul. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. You pick it up. It's called Wellness by Nathan Hill. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for listening. You can email me at icudoctorecmo@gmail.com if you want to say anything to me. You can follow me on TikTok. ICU Doctor is my handle. On Instagram, it's ICU Doctor TikTok. And that's it. Thanks for listening. Leave a review and share this podcast with somebody to help it grow. Thank you.